We are not part of mainstream America. I think we tend to think of ourselves as just being part of mainstream America. We're not, folks. Because if you just look at the numbers, it's clear that the vast majority of Americans are not actively involved in church. They may say they are, many of them, but when you look at the numbers, they're not. By just meeting this morning and worshiping God as followers of Jesus, we are doing something that is countercultural. We are going against the flow. We're making a countercultural statement. Guys, why am I sharing these things with you this morning? As I was preparing the sermon, I was really concerned that what I have just shared with you and what I'm about to share with you was really going to come across more like a classroom lecture and less like a sermon. But these are things we need to know. We need to be students of our culture. Of course, students of the Bible, but also students of our culture. As a matter of fact, in the New Testament, it's very, very clear in multiple passages that the Apostle Paul was a careful student of his culture, and he was surrounded by several different cultures. And depending on which culture he was ministering in, he would change his approach so that he could speak the language of the culture. He could be most effective in that particular culture. We need to pay attention to our culture. Why does this matter? Why does knowing these things matter? I'm afraid we don't fully appreciate the way our culture has changed. I'm afraid we don't fully recognize how the standing of the church in our society has changed. Yet we need to understand these things if we're going to be effective at evangelism, if we're going to be effective at making disciples. We've got to pay attention. We need to know. You see, for so long, the church was at the center of American society. It really was. The church was seen as one of the foundational institutions in American life and was at the social center of most local communities. If you were going to get to know people in a community, if you moved to a new town, you went to church. If you were going to find someone to date, you went to church. If you were going to connect with people even in regard to business and networking, you went to church because that's where everybody was. The church was the social center of the life of the local community. In other words, Christians were insiders in the culture, not outsiders, insiders. Christians were mainstream. The church was extremely influential in the formation of social standards. We referred to that a minute ago when we were talking about those blue laws and laws where businesses couldn't conduct business on Sunday. The church was extremely influential in the formation of social standards that was reflected in local and national laws. It was extremely influential in regard to politics. It was extremely influential in regard just to the general life of America. The cultural expressions, even what came out of Hollywood, they danced around a very careful line that they didn't cross a certain line because they knew it wouldn't be well received by the Christian public. It was scandalous. Back in 1939 in Gone with the Wind, when right at the end of that movie, Rhett Butler says, "Frankly, my dear, you can finish it, I won't finish it." Don't say it out loud. But he just said a single cuss word, and it was scandalous that he would do that. My, how times have changed. For much of our country's history, it was understood that being a good, patriotic American involved being a good Christian. The two were seen as going hand in hand. If you're going to be a good American, you're a good Christian. Some historians refer to this as civic religion or civil religion. It was just part of our understanding of what it meant to be an American. But the standing of the church in America has changed. The church is no longer at the center of American society. Folks, the statistics are extremely clear on this and extremely consistent. Every year, Christians are a smaller and smaller percentage of the American population. Every year. The church in America is not growing. Now, the church is growing by leaps and bounds in other places in the world. South America, Africa, Asia. Church is doing just fine. But not here. What's going on? Why is this happening? Now that's a question that has a whole range of complex answers. There's no one single answer to that. But this morning I want to focus on one part of the answer. A big part of the reason that the American church is withering is because we're still behaving like we're at the center of society. We're still thinking of ourselves in those terms. We're still acting in those ways. For example, we tend to think that if people want God, they'll come to us. We don't have to go to them. They know where to find us. Everybody knows where the church is. Everybody knows what a church is. It's almost like we believe it's still 1950. So we assume that everyone has a basic understanding of who Jesus is. We assume that everybody knows the basic gospel story. Everybody knows the message of the gospel. We assume that everybody knows who the church is and what the church is about. It's just part of being an American, right? You just know those things. But that's not true anymore. If indeed it ever really was. It's certainly not true now. The culture has changed, and our place in society has changed with it. This means we cannot take the same approach to evangelism or making disciples that we used in the past and expect it to be just as effective. The culture's changed. The context has changed. The public awareness of who we are and what we're about has changed. And so we need to reevaluate what we're doing. Martha Grace Reese, in her very thought-provoking book, Unbinding the Gospel, writes this. In 1960, pews filled when a loving, well-run church opened its doors. Today, people who have never attended a church populate our neighborhoods and workplaces. The next decades will see millions more. They won't have memories of a Christian grandmother, father, or next-door neighbor. The thought of going back to church when they're in trouble will never occur to them because they've never been inside a church building in the first place. For them, a church is an alien, possibly intimidating place, not a cradle of comfort and hope. That's sobering, folks. Because we're still pretty much, in most places in the country, not all, but in most places in the country, most people still have folks in their extended family that, were Christians. They may not be Christians themselves, but they had a grandmother, they had a grandfather who really emphasized to them the importance of Christianity and being involved in the church and believing in Jesus. That's changing, folks. We're only a generation or two away from that being gone. So what can we do about this? Is there any hope? Does the church, does Christianity have any chance in this context with the culture becoming darker and darker? Well, I hope that you already know that the answer, of course, is yes. Yes, there's hope. Absolutely there's hope. Where God is, there's always hope. But what can we do? For one thing, we need to remember the early church. We need to remember the early church. The church began as just a handful of believers in Jerusalem around 30 A.D. Just a handful of people. Within short order, within just a few years, that first church in Jerusalem became a megachurch, even by our standards. It was a megachurch. Thousands of people involved in this one church in Jerusalem.